raising revenue to invest in shared prosperity. I want to thank each of our truly distinguished witnesses for sharing their expertise today. And now let me offer my opening statement. The Biden administration's Build Back Better plan will cut taxes for working families, help small businesses, and invest in America's long-term economic prosperity, all while asking wealthy and big corporations to pay their fair share. Today, federal revenue is just 16.4% of the economy, and asking the wealthy and big corporations to contribute more to public revenue is consistent with supporting long-term economic growth. The Build Back Better plan will help provide American small businesses with a level playing field to compete with multinational corporations. If the Treasury Department projects that 97% of small businesses will be protected from increased taxes, and many will get a tax cut from reducing the corporate tax rate to 18% for incomes under $400,000. The Build Back Better plan promotes global competitiveness by working to end the race to the bottom on corporate taxes, letting American businesses compete on the basis of bringing the best products to market at the lowest price, instead of competing on who can avoid paying taxes. As a small businessman for almost 5 decades, I know that paid family leave will help small businesses retain workers. When I had workers who got sick or needed to care for a sick child, we provided paid leave to our employees because we would never want to leave our workers to choose between a paycheck or taking care of themselves or a loved one. At some point during their lives, all workers are going to need to take time away from work. By establishing a federal paid leave program, Build Back Better helps small businesses cover those inevitabilities and reduces the cost of turnover, which is why so many small businesses have come out in support of it. Small businesses will also benefit from extending the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, which will give businesses up to $5,000 to hire qualifying individuals, including eligible veterans. Asking the wealthy and big corporations to pay their fair share is consistent with supporting long-term economic growth. After the Obama and Biden administration allowed the Bush tax cuts for the very wealthy to expire in 2013, the economy added 8 million jobs in President Obama's second term. Job growth slowed under President Trump as the Trump tax cuts delivered a windfall for the wealthy, creating record stock buybacks and adding hundreds of billions to the deficit. While our friends across the aisle will likely claim that asking wealthy and big corporations to pay their fair share will hurt economic growth, the evidence just doesn't back them up. A Congressional Research Service report found that, quote, both labor supply and savings and investment are relatively insensitive to tax rates. In addition, improving IRS enforcement will increase revenue without raising rates, ensuring that businesses cannot gain advantages over their competitors by cheating on their taxes. We know that investing in working families, communities, and innovation is the key to broadly shared long-term economic growth, and that's exactly what the Build Back Better plan would do. Analysis by the Tax Policy Center shows that the Build Back Better revenue provisions passed out of the House Ways and Means Committee would abide by President Biden's pledge not to raise taxes on those making under $400,000 a year. So in 2022, households making under $500,000 will get their direct taxes cut on average, and middle-income parents will get a tax cut of about $3,000 on average. Extending the enhanced child tax credit and expanded child independent care tax credit, as proposed under Build Back Better, would help families access affordable child care and paid family leave. These two supports are both critical to helping parents, particularly mothers, remain engaged in the labor market. And we know that increased labor force participation is key to driving long-term and sustainable economic growth. Under President Biden, almost 4.5 million people have returned to work, and unemployment has dropped to 5.2%. In the first 2 quarters of 2021, real GDP grew at over 6%. In fact, second quarter was just revised upward again. And the Federal Reserve projects 5.9% real GDP growth this year. Core CPI inflation grew just 0.1%. That's 1 over 1,000 in August, even as real wages grew at 0.4%, 4 times faster. So passage of Build Back Better and the bipartisan infrastructure bill will cement these economic gains, improve productivity, lower inflationary pressures, and create long-term growth. Moody's Analytics projected that passing both bills will increase GDP growth in 2022 to 5.3%. Similarly, the Economic Policy Institute projects that the 2 bills will support 4 million jobs per year, including 556,000 manufacturing jobs and 312,000 construction jobs. For too long, the wealthy and big corporations have avoided paying their fair share. We have an opportunity now to rebalance the scale and invest in America's future to create long-term, broadly shared economic growth. We have been waiting for our Vice Chair, Senator Lee, to show up, but while he's not here yet, let me go ahead with the introductions of our speakers, and then we will slot Senator Lee as soon as he shows up. So, in the order of their witness testimony are four distinguished witnesses. Dr. Kimberly Clausing. Dr. Kimberly Clausing is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis in the Office of Tax Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Prior to that, Dr. Clausing was the Eric M. Zolt Professor of Tax Law and Policy at UCLA School of Law. And before that, she joined UCLA from Reed College, where she worked as the Thurman Miller and Walter Mintz Professor of Economics. Dr. Clausing has published numerous articles on taxation, with a particular emphasis on the taxation of multinational companies. And she is the author of an amazing, excellent book called Open, The Progressive Trade for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. She's a longtime friend of many of us and advisor. She received her BA in economics from Carleton College and an MA and PhD in economics from Harvard University. Ms. Chai-Ching Huang is the executive director of the Tax Law Center at NYU Law. Before starting the Tax Law Center, Ms. Huang was Senior Director of Economic Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where she worked on the analysis and design of a wide range of federal tax, fiscal, and economic policy proposals in collaboration with tax academics, practitioners, analysts, and advocates. Previously, Ms. Huang was a tax academic at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where she published research in tax law, policy, and regulation, and taught graduate and undergraduate tax law. Ms. Huang holds an LLM from Columbia Law School, where she was a Sir Wallace Rowling Fulbright and James Kent Scholar, and a Bachelor of Law and a Bachelor of Commerce and Economics from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Dr. Wendy Edelberg is the director of the Hamilton Project and a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. She's also a principal at WestEx Advisors. And prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Edelberg was chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office, something near and dear to all of us. Previously, Dr. Edelberg was the executive director of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which reported on the causes of the 2008 financial crisis. Dr. Edelberg also worked on issues related to macroeconomics, housing, and consumer spending at the White House Council of Economic Advisors and the Federal Reserve Board. Dr. Edelberg received a BA in economics from Columbia, an MBA from the University of Chicago, and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Finally, Dr. William McBride is the Vice President of Federal Tax and Economic Policy at the Tax Foundation. Dr. McBride previously served as a manager in the National Economic and Statistics Group at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Dr. McBride has experience researching and modeling the economics of taxation and issues related to tax reform at the state, federal, and international levels. From 2011 to 2014, Dr. McBride served as the chief economist at the Tax Foundation. Dr. McBride holds a BS in physics from the University of the South, a BS in electrical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis, and a PhD in economics from George Mason University. And with that, let me turn the floor over to the Vice Chair of the full committee, the distinguished senator from Utah, Senator Michael Lee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate it. Before the pandemic disrupted Americans' work lives and social connections, tax cuts and deregulation supported a thriving economy that delivered broad benefits to families and workers. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which provided historic relief to working and middle-class American families and led to higher wages, better benefits, and new employment opportunities across the country, was crucial to that prosperity. Our booming economy provided some of the largest benefits to those Americans who needed it most. Unemployment for Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, and Asian Americans fell to the lowest rates on record. Unemployment for women dropped to a near 65-year low, and low-income workers saw their wages rise at some of the fastest rates. All told, the wealth of the bottom 50% of all Americans increased by over 70% in the 3 years prior to the pandemic. In early 2020, more than 80% of working age Americans were employed and wages continued to rise. Pro-growth policy reform brought the economy roaring to life in a way that few forecasters thought might be possible. That success demonstrates an important truth. Americans benefit from lower taxes, less regulation, and more freedom. Unfortunately, we've come here today because the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress want to squeeze the American people with higher taxes and more regulation. They've proposed a $3.5 trillion tax and spend blowout, one that would increase Americans' taxes by over $2 trillion. It'd be the largest tax increase in my lifetime, and it would substantially expand the federal government's footprint into our homes, our businesses, and across our economy. Now, let's be clear. The major winners from the Democrats' plan are special interests and beltway bureaucrats. Our economy is still recovering from the pandemic. Now is one of the worst times to saddle our economy with higher taxes. The recovery has stopped accelerating, and American families are being hit by higher prices for essential goods. Things like everything from groceries to housing to gasoline keep getting more expensive. Inflation is rising at its fastest pace in 3 decades, and it's making it harder to make ends meet. Wage increases are being swamped by higher prices, and job growth is stalling. Democrats' reckless tax and spend boondoggle will only make things worse. Here's what we know this tax plan would do to American families and workers and businesses. It would raise taxes on American families, despite President Biden's pledge to the contrary. The nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation and the left-leaning Tax Policy Center both agree that the plan would hike taxes on low and middle income families making less than $400,000 a year. The Democrats' tax plan would also drive jobs for American workers overseas. It would raise the federal corporate tax rate to 26.5%, making the cost of doing business in the U.S. higher than in Canada, Mexico, Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and China. American workers would pay the price. They'd pay for it in lost jobs, and slower wage growth, and less investment in things like domestic manufacturing and innovative research and development. In 10 years, 2/3 of the tax burden from this corporate tax increase would be shouldered by low and middle income workers. And perhaps worst of all, the Democrats' tax plan would embolden Washington to pick winners and losers rather than allowing entrepreneurs to meet the needs of American consumers. This is about so much more than penalizing successful Americans with even higher taxes. This is about putting more of Americans' resources under the control of Washington politicians. Democrats' tax plan would cost American families, workers, and businesses. It would mean less innovation, lower wages, and fewer jobs. It would increase the size and scope of the federal government. It would make our country less prosperous, less fair, and less free. We know what works. Keeping taxes low helps to support a thriving economy. It benefits all Americans. We should return to the policies that made the pre-pandemic economy so successful for so many Americans. Congress should keep taxes low and predictable by making the reforms in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. And then we should restrain government spending. It's on a runaway path right now by setting clear and enforceable rules for fiscal discipline. Look, we simply can't, as in it simply won't work. We can't succeed at taxing and spending our way into shared prosperity. Instead, we need to stop spending indiscriminately and make America the best place in the world to do business, pursue happiness, and earn success. Thank you.
Senator Lee, thank you very much. Now let me recognize Dr. Clausing for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Byer. Chairman Byer, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee, thank you so much for inviting me to share my views on the relationship between tax policy and the economy. The present moment is a very consequential one for the future of tax policy. We have an opportunity in front of us to create a modern, efficient, and fair tax system, tax system capable of funding investments that are essential to the creation of a prosperous U.S. business environment and to the sort of inclusive economic growth that can benefit all Americans. First off, raising adequate government revenue is important for funding the nation's priorities and for shoring up the fundamental economic strengths that are central to job creation. We need revenue to build roads and bridges, to fund education, training and research, to mitigate climate change, and to support families from tackling child poverty, maintaining support for the elderly. These investments are important to all of us, including those in the business community. Right now, however, the United States raises less revenue than we need. We are in the bottom fifth of all OECD countries in terms of revenue raised relative to the size of our economy across all levels of government. We raise particularly low revenue taxing capital and corporations. The Joint Committee on Tax reports that U.S. multinationals pay an average tax rate of only 8%. In contrast, companies located in our top trading partners pay 18%. We collect far less corporate income tax revenues than our trading partners, and we only collect half what we collected before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, when we collected 2% of GDP. Our corporate tax revenues are low despite the fact that U.S. companies show very high corporate profits, both in historic and in comparative terms. Indeed, the United States corporate sector is the most profitable in the world, dominating every measure of corporate success. Beyond revenue, tax reform is also essential to address the offshoring and profit-shifting incentives that are embedded in current law. Under current law, foreign income is sometimes tax-exempt and sometimes taxed at half the rate of domestic income, providing very strong incentives to locate both activity and profit offshore. Although the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act included a global minimum tax called GILTI, it did not stop profit shifting. Indeed, the very large share of U.S. multinational income booked in very low tax jurisdictions did not change after 2017. Unfortunately, current law creates an America-last tax system. Even high or medium tax foreign income is preferred to U.S. income because it can be blended with low tax income and taxed at a 50% discount. This is why a country-by-country minimum tax system is so crucial. These reforms will also create a fairer tax system. The past 4 decades can be characterized by 3 related trends: large, troubling increases in income inequality, multiple reductions in tax rates for those at the top, and difficulty making ends meet for many lower and middle income families. Under current proposals, large expansions in the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and the child independent care tax credit will help address the needs of typical Americans. In short, asking for somewhat larger tax contributions from the country's wealthiest households and from the most profitable corporations will help us raise the revenue that is needed to support the long-term competitiveness of the U.S. economy and the well-being of American families. Finally, there are many ways that our tax system needs to be modernized to suit the 21st century. The mobility of capital means that the taxation of multinational companies is subject to large tax competition pressures. The existential threat posed by climate change makes it critical to make changes in the tax code that incentivize clean energy. In both areas, cooperation with other countries pursuing the same goals yields double dividends, encouraging them to take firm actions of their own and solving long-standing collective action problems. A crucial way to modernize our tax system is to also ensure that we collect the tax that is due. The tax gap, which is forecast to total about $7 trillion over the coming decade, creates both inefficiencies and inequities. Honest businesses who pay their tax obligations in full compete with businesses whose owners shirk their tax responsibilities. Workers who earn solely wage or salary income fully report their income accurately, but face higher tax burdens than taxpayers using evasion to hide opaque sources of income. Those at the top of the income distribution are disproportionately responsible for the tax gap. Providing the IRS with the resources and information they need will give us a more progressive tax system. American taxpayers will benefit across many dimensions: improved taxpayer service, better targeted audits towards those that evade, and hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue that allow lower taxes elsewhere, less debt, and better government. In conclusion, the tax reforms that we will discuss today are essential for encouraging U.S. job creation, economic growth, and inclusive prosperity. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Klossing, very much. I will next hear from Ms. Chai-Cheng Huang for your testimony.
Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee, I'm honoured to testify about an opportunity to meet the nation's most pressing economic needs. Sound tax policy can lift the living standards of low and moderate income Americans and support economic growth with shared benefits for workers, families, and businesses. And that is because it can raise revenues to support investments in areas like infrastructure, education, scientific research, and worker training that are known to deliver long-term returns. Investments can also reduce the costs of challenges like climate change. Further, lawmakers are considering proposals including a stronger child tax credit. And those are also true investments because they deliver long-run benefits for the trajectories of children and the broader economy. Research shows that such credits increase the likelihood that children grow up healthier, do better in school, attend college, and earn more as adults. And these long-run dividends can be large. Novel research also suggests that financial stability can help more children develop and apply their talents for research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And the country is currently losing out on so much of that potential. 17 Nobel laureate economists have explained that the package that lawmakers are considering will ease long-term inflationary pressures. And that's because it combines investments that improve growth with revenues to finance those investments without adding to long-term deficits. Furthermore, sound tax policy can scale back on inefficient tax breaks and can help investment flow to where it's most productive rather than where the tax savings are the most lucrative. It can also reduce complex and wasteful tax planning games. And in doing so, tax policy can level the playing field for small, domestic, and honest businesses so they can fairly compete with businesses that use tax avoidance, profit shifting to tax havens, or even outright tax evasion as a business strategy. The revenue-raising proposals before Congress would meet those goals. They would first ensure that companies and wealthy filers pay what they already owe. Second, they would reverse some of the 2017 tax law's corporate rate cuts that went even deeper than what businesses asked for, and also address subsidies for locating profits and investments offshore. Third, they would scale back tax breaks that allow some of the wealthiest people in the country to pay little or no income tax on very large sources of income. Such tax policies are far more likely to strengthen the economy than tax cuts concentrated at the top of the income distribution. Careful research finds no evidence that the 2017 tax law increased investment or wages above trends already in place. In the face of that disappointing track record, some proponents of the tax cut strategy have instead cited predictions from paid studies that are deeply flawed or inaccurately described current proposals. Another response has been to promote a view of competitiveness that misattributes America's economic success very narrowly to its willingness to subsidize multinationals' tax avoidance, rather than the quality of American ideas, people, and infrastructure. Those have already accumulated large profits and are seeking to protect their tax preferences can afford to push this short-sighted view of America's competitive potential. But investments supported by good tax policy can ensure that more children can be part of the next generation of innovators who may generate new breakthroughs and businesses with widely shared benefits. And of course, successful businesses and individuals will continue to benefit from America's infrastructure. Finally, some may try to frame the trade-offs that lawmakers now face as requiring them to choose between areas of deep need, including reducing child poverty, broadening access to community college and paid leave, addressing climate change, filling holes in Medicaid, and more. But the actual trade-off is much broader. It's between those investments and to what extent policy maintains the status quo of very wealthy taxpayers and corporations not paying taxes that they owe and keeping provisions of law that allow them to face very low tax rates. Thank you for inviting me, and I would be glad to take your questions.
Ms. Wong, thank you very much. We'll now hear from Dr. Edelberg. Dr. Edelberg, the floor is yours.
Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee. My name is Wendy Edelberg, and I am the director of the Hamilton Project and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Before coming to Brookings, I was chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office. As we discuss the tax provisions contained in the reconciliation package and other ambitious policy proposals, I'd like to focus on 3 points. First, investments in the social insurance system are vital for ensuring broad access to opportunities and advancement and for making our economy more resilient. There's extensive evidence demonstrating how effectively these programs work and why they should be expanded. Second, adopting the ambitious policies included in these packages would not create worrying inflation risk, and those packages' effect on the long-term fiscal trajectory would be modest. Finally, although the contemplated tax increases would have a small negative effect on incentives to work and invest, other policies in the package would increase incentives to work and invest. Nearly everyone in the United States directly benefits from the social insurance system at some point in their lives. Moreover, everyone indirectly benefits from it, either from knowing the system would be there during some time of unexpected hardship, or simply because it helps to support the overall economy. During the pandemic-induced economic downturn, some of these programs have proven particularly effective. As a result of the enormous fiscal support provided to households in 2020, the percentage of the US population in poverty fell from 12% to 9%. There is more to do. Implementing new policies with regard to childcare and paid leave would lower barriers to work among parents and those with caregiving responsibilities, and those policies would improve outcomes for children. Making permanent the full refundability of the child tax credit would lock in place reductions in child poverty. Making permanent the recent expansion of the EITC for adults without children would reduce poverty and income inequality and increase labor force participation. Subsidies would decrease uninsured rates by potentially 14%. These are not the only improvements to the social insurance system included in the reconciliation package, but they are illustrative examples of how strengthening this system would improve well-being and make our economy more resilient. At the same time, the ambitious policies included in the packages being considered would not create worrying inflation risk, and their effect on the long-term fiscal trajectory would be modest. Policymakers have stated their goal is to include increases in tax revenues and decreases in spending that would fully offset policies that would decrease revenues and increase spending. If something close to a full offset is achieved, the reconciliation package would do little to the projected debt trajectory. To be clear, policymakers still have long-term challenges with regards to the federal budget. However, this reconciliation package, even if the estimates end up showing it would modestly increase the cumulative deficit over the next decade, would not worsen those challenges in a notable way. Although many of the changes being considered would increase people's incentives to work and invest, the revenue-raising policies would have muted negative effects. For example, the reconciliation package undoes some of the reduction in the corporate tax rate put in place in the 2017 Tax Act. Consensus projections were that the large reduction in 2017 only boosted the level of investment modestly. Conversely, reversing some of that reduction would have only small negative effects on investment, even as it raised substantial revenue. In addition, the package increases the effective marginal tax rates on labor income, but only for a small portion of the labor force comprised of the highest income people. Any negative effect on the aggregate labor supply would likely be hard to identify after the fact. The policies that would increase recipients' incentives to work, save, and invest could have large positive effects. For example, access to high quality and affordable childcare could be a game changer for labor force participation among mothers of young children. With a larger and more productive workforce, firms would have greater incentives to work and invest in the United States. To wrap up, despite headwinds created by the Delta variant, the economy is recovering. This is the moment to strengthen the social insurance system and to enact an ambitious federal investment package. Together, those policy changes would make the US economy more resilient and productive over the longer term, and They would broaden the degree to which prosperity in the United States is shared across workers and families. Thank you.
Dr. Edelberg, thank you very much. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. McBride.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the Joint Economic Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Today, I will share the key findings of our analysis of the economic effects of the revenue provisions of the most recent version of the President's Build Back Better agenda, the House Ways and Means Committee's reconciliation bill. The House bill relies heavily on corporate tax increases. It would raise the corporate tax rate 5 percentage points to 26.5%, which would be the largest increase in the rate in more than 70 years. Including the average state corporate tax, the combined federal state corporate tax rate would be almost 31%, the third highest corporate tax rate in the OECD. A similar ranking would result when looking at effective corporate tax rates, which account for various deductions and other tax preferences. The bill also raises or introduces several other taxes on U.S. multinationals, taxes that do not exist in other countries, including the GILTI tax. The result would be to disadvantage U.S. companies and their workers in favor of companies based in lower tax countries, such as Canada, the UK, or just about anywhere in Europe. It is important to remember that corporate taxes are not just paid by corporate shareholders. By reducing investment and productivity growth, higher corporate taxes lead to lower wages across the board. This is why the OECD finds that corporate taxes are the most economically damaging way to raise revenue, followed by individual income taxes, consumption taxes, and then property taxes. Several studies demonstrate that corporate taxes are borne in part by workers. For example, a recent study found that workers bear about half of the tax burden in the form of lower wages, with low-skilled, young, and female employees disproportionately harmed. Our modeling of the House bill indicates that the corporate tax increases alone would reduce long-run GDP by about 0.6%, shrink the capital stock by 1.2%, cut wages by 0.5%, and eliminate about 120,000 jobs. The House bill also levies several tax increases on high-earning individuals, especially pass-through business owners, causing the top combined tax rate on ordinary and pass-through business income to exceed 52% on average. The top combined tax rate on long-term capital gains and qualified dividends would reach 37% on average. These higher tax rates come with a cost. It will reduce incentives to work, save, and invest, broadly reducing employment opportunities throughout the economy. In total, we estimate that the House plan, including the corporate and individual income tax increases, would reduce the size of the economy by about 1% in the long run, shrink the capital stock by 1.8%, cut wages by 0.7%, and cost more than 300,000 jobs. While the plan would raise more than $2 trillion in tax revenue over the next decade on a gross basis, it would give away about half of it in the form of dozens of tax credits, leaving just over $1 trillion in net revenue. After accounting for the smaller economy, the plan raises even less revenue, about $800 billion over the next decade on net. In other words, the House plan would reduce long-run GDP by more than $2 for every dollar raised, meaning the cost in terms of GDP loss far outweigh the benefits in terms of tax revenue. This occurs for two reasons. The revenue is raised in economically destructive ways, and a large part of that revenue is spent in the form of tax credits with little to no benefits for long-term economic growth. Tax credits are aimed at a variety of issues that deserve attention, including childcare, clean energy, housing, and broadband development. However, cluttering up the tax code with more tax credits comes with many downsides, including increased complexity and compliance costs for taxpayers, as well as additional administrative burden for the IRS, which is ill-equipped to take on so many extra duties unrelated to tax collection. The bulk of the tax credits are aimed at providing temporary relief to families with children, a worthy goal, but likely better administered by a spending agency, such as the Social Security Administration. In general, tax policy should be focused on how to raise revenue in the least economically harmful manner, and other goals should be handled as public spending subject to the appropriations process. It is important to address the escalating cost of childcare healthcare, housing, and other concerns. But it should be done in a sustainable way that does not greatly add to the deficit or reduce job opportunities, wage growth, or people's ability to succeed and attain a higher standard of living. Thank you for your time and attention.
Dr. McBride, thank you very much. We'll now begin the round of questions. I will begin, followed, I believe, by Senator Lee. So let me start. Dr. Clausen, companies often worry that tax increases will make them less competitive. In fact, I've been on many Zooms in the last couple of months with corporations complaining about this. In your judgment, how will reforming the international tax system affect competitiveness?
That mute button problems, but thank you for that question. There are three really important ways to think about competitiveness, and in my view, all three of them are much improved because of this set of proposals. So first, if we think about economic fundamentals, like what makes the US economically strong, right? These are things like our infrastructure, our workers, our institutions, our business environment of entrepreneurship. Those fundamentals will be strengthened if we have adequate revenue to invest in things like climate change mitigation, like research, like education and training. So in that definition of competitiveness, this is definitely helpful. A second definition of competitiveness thinks about the competitiveness of the US location as a place to do things in comparison to offshore locations. Under current law, there's a tax preference for the offshore location relative to the US location because offshore income is either exempt from US tax or taxed with a 50% discount. Under these proposals, that tilt in the playing field in favor of foreign income and away from US income would be dramatically reduced, and that would reduce the tax incentive to locate offshore. So this is a very important way that we can improve the attractiveness of US job creation and US activity, as well as buttress the US tax base. A final notion of competitiveness concerns the competitiveness of US companies when they're operating offshore relative to their foreign counterparts, right? So you can imagine a US company and a foreign company both competing in a low tax rate country. That type of competitiveness is also improved under the tax policy environment that we see in front of us, because there is a historic opportunity to increase tax rates faced abroad due to ongoing negotiations to end the race to the bottom in corporate taxes. So when we look at the typical tax burden faced by US companies relative to the typical tax burden faced by foreign companies, that will be narrowing rather than widening. And I should point out that even if we ignore changes in foreign law, even if we assume that there are none of them, that a recent Reuters study found that even if you adopted the full-fledged Biden proposals on corporate and international tax, that US companies would still have a tax advantage relative to their peers. They looked at the 52 largest multinational companies, and they found that our current tax advantage is about 8 percentage points relative to their own competitors cited in financial statements, and that advantage would still be at least 3 percentage points. And that's ignoring all of these investments in things like clean energy, and it's also ignoring any possible change in foreign tax laws. So we think that this set of proposals enhances every type of competitiveness.
Thank you very much. Dr. Edelberg, as the former chief economist of the Congressional Budget Office, you're probably better equipped to understand than anybody the impact of this legislation on our fiscal health. So do you worry about the long-term fiscal trajectory of the nation if we pass an ambitious reconciliation in the infrastructure bill? And specifically, do you worry about inflation?
I don't think that the packages that are currently being contemplated would have a notable effect on the fiscal trajectory over the next decade. Policymakers have stated that their goal is to fully offset any tax decreases or spending increases with tax increases and spending decreases. But even if those weren't fully offset, I don't see that this would notably increase the fiscal trajectory in a worrying way. Financial markets have made it very clear that they are not perturbed by the level of fiscal debt, the level of federal debt, and they're not perturbed by the projection of federal debt over the next decade under current law. And this wouldn't do much to that projection over time. And so you also asked about inflation. I don't see that the packages currently being considered would create notable and any kind of worrying inflation risk. And that's for two main reasons. One, the Joint Committee on Taxation estimates in their score that the policies would essentially be deficit neutral over the next 2 years, which is to say that all of any spending increases would be offset by spending decreases or tax increases. So we would see little economic effect from those policies over the next 2 years, and other policies would take years to stand up. So inflation risk is a thing that we should be worried about, but it has nothing to do with the policy discussions at hand.
Thank you, Dr. Edelberg, very much. My time is up. I'll recognize my friend from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, with the shout out that the president appointed an Arizonan to be the new chair of the National Endowment of the Humanities and an Arizonan to be the new chair of the National Endowment of the Arts. David,
Yep,
you were
and-
left out, but you get to ask questions now.
And a Native American from our state, so it's wonderful. Mr. Chairman, and just as a aside, but an incredibly important one, as you've heard the left's witnesses all throw the caveat that the Democrats have a stated commitment. Steny Hoyer even, after I gave a floor speech, came and reaffirmed right after my discussion that the left has made a commitment. They will pay for every dime of the spending in this package, whether it be the transfer payments, whether it be the subsidies to the rich. And so we look forward to the left keeping their commitment that this will be fully paid for. Because without doing that, much of the economic discussion we're having here is intellectually vacuous and dishonest. So, Mr. McBride, I want to first thank you, Tax Foundation, for doing the only intellectually credible analysis of the proposals we've seen so far. But I wanted to go a bit further. I'm one of those that has a fixation on how you make the working poor less poor. And we've seen some of the success of economic expansion, providing resources and ability and making labor wages more robust. When Tax Foundation did their modeling, I know you worked through the capital stock, the actual revenues, those things. You came up with the, what was it, $880 billion of probably true actual increase in revenues. Was there any attempt to model a society that moves to almost a social welfare transfer payment model, and what that will actually do to labor stock and labor participation incentives?
Well, we follow the empirical literature on the long run impacts of transfer payments. And studies from the IMF, for instance, and other major organizations indicate that it's very small. It's close to zero. Some studies indicate it's actually has a negative impact on long-term economic growth. And so we've adopted the assumption of a zero impact of those type of transfer payments.
And my reason, Dr. McBride, for the discussion is we have a couple articles, and Chairman Beyer, we're going to submit them for the record, that basically focus on social stratification and freezing of social mobility in the societies that do almost the identical model to the left's proposal, that people find themselves trapped in their quartiles. And we were struggling trying to figure out how you would even model such a thing.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the idea of mobility and movement, from one income quintile to the next over one's lifetime, or from one generation to the next, is a very interesting topic. And
yes,
there is no doubt that there's actually a great deal of movement across income quintiles within one's lifetime, with average person's lifetime, that the millionaires or the top 1% are not monolithic. They are actually changing from year to year. You can look at the list of the richest people in the U.S. or any other list. It's changing. It changes quite a lot over the course of 10 or 20 years, and essentially that's because wealth is episodic, and someone can really hit it big with a very successful business, and that doesn't last forever. Very often that is lasts only a few years, or
Well,
misfortune can hit.
Dr. McBride, look, and the tyranny of the clock, because some of this would be actually very interesting. If our ultimate goal was we wish to deal with child poverty, but we also want a society that closes income inequality. There's good literature that shows transfer payments give you a nice pop and then freeze your society. And I have a fixation of how do we help with child poverty, but then also maximize economic expansion. And even some of the details in everything, even from some of the other witnesses, it looks like long-term capital stock economic growth opportunity, particularly for the working poor, will be actually fairly severely damaged by the end of the decade by the Democrat proposal. And with that, Mr. Byer, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Schweiker, very much. Now recognize the congressman from Madison, Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thanks to all the witnesses. Ms. Huang, I hope I'm saying that right. Huang?
Well, thank you.
Huang, thank you. Let me ask you this question, because I think there's a lot of Halloween-like behavior going on, people trying to scare the average person about taxes, scare small businesses. I'm a 33-year small business owner, over half of my lifetime. Curious when you said this is about leveling the playing field between small business and big business. And I know there's some provisions in particular, I think, for example, about corporations first 5 million and et cetera. Can you just talk a little bit about what you meant in a little more detail, as if you were explaining it to a local Wisconsin chamber group?
Yeah. Well, when I've talked to small business people, they really prefer not to think that much about taxes. They'd rather be thinking about their products, their customers, their supply chains, all of the real world things that really sort of drive business growth and productivity. But that sort of falls down when they have to compete with big businesses that are shifting profits offshore and using complex tax havens to undercut them. Or they have another business down the street that they know is kind of taking in cash and not reporting it to the IRS. So there are a range of proposals that would help these honest, productive small businesses by leveling the playing field for them and allow really both them and other businesses to focus more on the core things that make America productive, as opposed to playing games with taxes. And I think that's one of the biggest things. The other part, of course, is the investment part. Small businesses, I think, would also like to not have to think about sort of potholes in the roads that they're using to get their product to market, or other sort of lacks in infrastructure or skilled workforce that make it hard to run a business.
And I agree with you on the supply chain issues. If you ask my husband, who's spending many extra hours every night trying to find the same stuff that he used to be able to find, yeah, he would vote for whoever figured that issue out. It's absolutely a huge issue in the small business side. Another question, as we talk about how, as I think it was referred to as, the average person's going to pay more in taxes. Again, I like to do it, with people I might run into. So the median income in Wisconsin for a family is $81,829. If they have 2 children, let's say one's at childcare age and one's in elementary school, I looked at what the child tax credit does for that family, and that's going to be $3,600 a year for one of their kids and $3,000 for another kid. They're going to benefit from the child care provisions. If they're paying 7% of their income, that's going to be $5,700 instead of the median $12,597. And again, I'm only counting one child. I'm already up to 13.5 savings. I'm not even counting the prescription drug savings. I'm not counting the paid leave if they need that. Can you just address that as well a little bit about the reality is for that median family in Wisconsin, are they paying more like it's been inferred by some of the crypt keepers trying to talk about Halloween and scare people, or are they actually going to be benefiting pretty well?
Yeah, they will be benefiting. And to your point, I've seen some numbers that sort of average out the tax increase that a hedge fund manager will pay with the tax cut that a teacher or one of those small business people would get. And in fact, the vast majority of working families and small businesses will be benefiting from reduced costs and tax cuts. It's really only the very top of the income scale that faces those tax increases.
Great, thank you. And then one last one, I'm gonna throw out a little wild ball here. Hopefully our chairman doesn't care. I find it amazing that Jeff Bezos pays virtually nothing in taxes, that between 2006 and 2018, his wealth grew by 127 billion. He only paid 1.1% of his income in federal, or 1.1% of that in federal taxes. That year, one year he claimed $4,000 child tax credit. 2018, he paid no federal income taxes. You know, for a guy who has his employees having to carry bottles with them when they're on the road to urinate in, tell me, what do I say to that average person in my district who's saying, why is it our tax code rewards someone like him? What can we do to go after someone with that kind of wealth in the long term?
It is a major hole in the tax code. That is real income, and that is income that Jeff Bezos or anyone else that's making $100 billion in gains in their stock prices can use to fund a pretty comfortable lifestyle. And it doesn't make sense that they face a lower tax rate on that income than a teacher or a professional that's earning a salary. So I completely agree we should be addressing that, and that is one of the things that a number of the proposals would do.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pocan, thank you very much. We'll now turn to a professional tax collector, the former Treasurer of Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all our witnesses for being here today. I mean, Congress should be concerned more with the economic crisis that's unfolding before us, an unprecedented worker shortage coupled with rising inflation and energy prices. But instead, this bill forces through trillions in new spending and is fixated on raising taxes. So much so that President Biden will break his promise and raise taxes on those who make less than $400,000. The Joint Committee on Taxation found that 2/3 of Biden's corporate tax hike will be felt by middle-income taxpayers, including small businesses that file taxes as individuals. It's not honest to say this legislation, which the New York Times describes as touching virtually every American at every point in life from conception to old age, won't cost a dime. That's clearly not true. The many new social spending programs in this plan won't create economic growth. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimates it'll actually lower federal revenues by around $1.2 trillion over the next decade. The administration's budget even acknowledges that growth isn't a priority for them in the ideal world. It only forecasts a meager 2% GDP growth by 2023, with it dropping even lower until 2029. Many inside Washington seem to think that just because a bill spends lots of money, it's automatically a good investment. But Washington has a lousy track record of spending taxpayer money. Out in the real world, spending money doesn't magically make money. The so-called good investment gets worse when you dig into the actual details under the hood. Much of it will go to force Americans to do what a bureaucrat in Washington decides is good for them, like what car to drive. The Green New Deal provisions would make working class families across the U.S. pay more in taxes so that millionaires in California can ride off a new electric vehicle. The bottom line is the agenda is not based on reality. It's going to crush small businesses, even though it's got a poll-tested slogan like Build Back Better. I hope that we get serious about the dire financial situation our country faces. You just took in more than $3.4 trillion in revenue last fiscal year. If we took time to prioritize spending, that could very well be more than enough to support the United States government. Dr. McBride, as you know, the evidence shows that higher tax rates do not always yield higher increases in revenue. For example, despite the wide variation in federal marginal tax rates over the years, in the 60s, they were even as high as 90%. The share of federal revenue has remained relatively steady in the post-World War II era, ranging between 15 and 20% of GDP. Indeed, scholars at your organization have pointed out that many studies show income reported by taxpayers falls as marginal tax rates rise. Punitively high tax rates not only increase incentives to shift or underreport income, they also have high economic cost. how should policymakers think about the trade-off between high tax rates, raising revenue, and economic performance?
Thank you. That's a very important thing to remember, that it's like you said, it's not that simple. Raising rates leads to more revenue in every case. Probably the most extreme example demonstrating that is capital gains. This is widely recognized from the history of changing tax rates on capital gains, that there's a sort of revenue maximizing tax rate of about 28, 29, 30% in that range. And that's what the Joint Committee on Taxation assumes as well. This is widely understood in revenue estimating among revenue estimators. So, for instance, that is well below the 37% average capital gains tax rate that would apply when factoring in the state capital gains rate under the House bill. So another example there is corporate taxes. And so here we can look at across the developed world, countries that have generally been lowering their corporate tax rates quite a lot over the last 40 years, roughly in half. Come down from around 40, 50% corporate tax rates in most countries down to closer to 20% on average. And what has been the impact on revenue? You might think that revenues would have collapsed across all of these countries. In fact, they have been fairly stable as a share of GDP and actually increased moderately in many cases. And that's over this very long period of time. So there's something going on there along the lines of what you're talking about. Reported income goes down. The production of income, incentives to generate income go down as marginal tax rates increase. And it can be a very large effect.
Well, thank you. I wish I had more time because I want to talk a little bit about the budget deficit and the increase there. But thank you for enlightening us on some of that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Estes, and hang in there. If we have time, it would be great to do a second round. But now let me recognize the gentleman from Southern California, Congressman Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Huang, just want to say, when I was a student at NYU Law School, I took a couple tax classes. I thought it was so fascinating that I actually went into tax law when I practiced, and that was a huge mistake. So I'm saying that the academics are a lot more fun than the practice. So my free advice is don't leave. But I had a question for you on this topic, which was about taxing the wealthy. One of the objections I had to the Trump tax cuts, and I didn't disagree with every part of it, because I thought the corporate rate needed to be adjusted. I thought we had to fix some international tax things. But to give all that money to wealthy people who didn't need it, and we saw that it did not increase growth according to the president's projections. We saw also that inequality has continued to rise, and I just want to know, what's your take on the long-term economic impact on economic growth or job creation if we were to increase taxes on capital gains for high-income earners? It seems to me, just to set that up, is that wealthy people have all the stuff that they need to buy, right? They got their fancy refrigerator, they got the cars that they need, they might have a second house. There's no stimulative effect to giving them money. How should we tax them, and what's wrong with raising the capital gains rate along the lines that the president suggested?
It's a great question, because it comes up over and over again, the idea that this would damage investment, which is just simply not borne out by the reality. The model, this sort of trickle-down idea that increasing taxes on very high income, high wealth people would somehow sort of make its way down to workers, that model can break down at each and every link. There's not that much evidence that the tax cuts are very effective at spurring private investment. Cutting taxes can increase after-tax returns to investment, but they can also mean that people need to save and invest less to sort of meet their savings goals. And also, if the taxes are falling on excess returns from market power, rents, and other sort of special returns, there's not going to be a hit to the overall size of investment. So you see pretty small private investment changes in response to tax changes, and that can be overwhelmed by the effect on public saving and investment because there is a very large fiscal cost.
And I think also the CBO does assess that even after all the growth projections haven't been met, that after they haven't been met, that the add to the deficit from that was $1.9 trillion, which has a real drag effect on investment, as you know. Dr. Klossing, I want to just talk to you a little bit about corporate tax revenues. I would have definitely agreed with Mr. McBride that 35% was too high. I thought we were uncompetitive. At the time, the Business Roundtable was asking for 25%. So was Dave Camp, who was then the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and President Trump took it down to 21%. Now there's talk about raising it back up to 25, say, and business communities saying that the effective rate would be a lot higher because there's been base broadening. Can you tell me how we should analyze that? Is that true, and how should that matter as we analyze what the appropriate corporate tax treatment is?
I think as a general principle, it's very useful to have a broad base, in part because you don't need to raise the rate as high if you're taxing all the income. If you tax some of the income at a high rate and some of the income at a low rate, right, then the income kind of rushes over to the place where the rate is lower. So in several aspects of these tax policy proposals, we've tried to even the tax treatment of different types of income. So for a rich person, whether it's capital or labor, for a multinational company, whether it's foreign or domestic, for small businesses, whether they're paying their tax dutifully or whether they're evading tax, right? And so I think that this is a very important feature. It's certainly the case that if the base is broader, all things equal, at a particular tax rate, that more tax will be paid. The question is whether that is a bad thing. You know, I think that the corporate tax is a good tax.
What would be, just, I want to
Yeah.
run out of time, so
Yeah.
can you assess what the effective rate would be if we were looking at 25% before? Now there's base broadening. What are we, if we raise it up to nominally 25%, what are we talking about for effective rate?
Yeah, I think part of the difficulty there is that the actual statutory rates don't bear a lot of resemblance to the true tax rate paid by companies. So for instance, the Joint Committee on Tax is telling you right now that US companies are paying about 8%, the big multinationals, right? If you ask them to pay more, it will be more than 8%, but 8 doesn't really reflect current law, which is the 21 for domestic and 10.5 for foreign, right? So while the Biden proposals would certainly raise effective rates, they would still remain competitive with those in peer countries. Right now, we're way below the effective rate in peer countries.
Thank you. My time's expired. I want to just commend your testimony from 2017 about carbon taxes. Maybe we have time to do that later.
Great. Thank you, Congressman Peters, very much. If Senator Cruz is with us, you would be recognized next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses who are here. Dr. McBride, President Biden's and the Democrats' so-called Build Back Better Act, as reported by Ways and Means, is estimated to reduce long-run GDP by 0.98%, which in today's dollars amounts to about $332 billion of lost output annually, each and every year. It's also estimated that the plan would in the long run raise about $152 billion in new tax revenue. That being said, for every dollar of revenue raised, economic output would fall by $2.18. Your team has done extensive work analyzing these proposals. What are your thoughts on the potential impact of the Democrats' plan on the U.S. budget deficit and America's long-term fiscal health?
Thank you for that question. It's very difficult to pinpoint the impact on the deficit when we don't have estimates from the CBO or anyone else on all of the spending programs that are being discussed in this reconciliation bill. What we have assumed in our modeling for purposes of estimating the impact on the deficit is we have assumed the top line number of $3.5 trillion. And actually deficits in that's $3.5 trillion over the 10-year budget window, and in the out years, no impact on the deficit based on compliance with the Byrd rule, the Senate. And but even there, due to the the impacts on the economy, the reduction in wages, which is a major tax base for the federal government, and other tax bases, that so-called dynamic revenue that accounts for this reduction in the size of the economy falls to only about 800 billion over the 10-year window. And so that you can tell that is considerably lower than the top line spending numbers that are being discussed on the order of 2 trillion or plus. And so we do find it does increase deficits in the 10-year window, and that those deficits do matter. In our modeling, the deficits, the increasing deficits mean that if we continue with the historical pattern of a lot of our national debt is bought up by foreigners, assuming that continues to hold, that means foreigners own a larger and larger share of U.S. Assets, and a larger amount of income in the form of interest payments goes to foreigners as a result of the increase in the debt. That means there's a reduction in U.S. income as measured by sort of gross national product.
So Dr. McBride, a minute ago, you just described the cost of the Bernie Sanders socialist budget as 3.5 trillion. President Biden, rather remarkably, has claimed the cost of it is $0. I'm reminded of what Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman said, which is there's no such thing as a free lunch. How can you possibly reconcile this administration's claim that a $3.5 trillion bill costs $0?
Right. I think that charitably, the interpretation there is that has no impact on the deficit. But as I've just discussed, it does have an impact on the deficit when you account for the reduction in the size of the economy, the reduction in the tax bases, the big tax bases.
So you found, if I heard your number correctly, a little bit over $2 trillion of impact. Is that right?
Thereabouts.
Okay. Let me ask you also, President Biden has repeatedly pledged that the Democrats would not increase taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. And yet this Bernie Sanders socialist budget does exactly that. And in fact, Congress's own Joint Committee on Taxation, so not a Republican organization, the Joint Committee on Taxation, shows that Biden's promise is unequivocally false, and that tax rates will increase on virtually every income level. Taxpayers earning $40,000 a year, $50,000, $50,000 to $75,000, $100,000. Pretty much everyone earning $40,000 a year or more will see their taxes go up. Can you explain why that is? And we're talking about 85% of taxpayers that either see no impact or see their taxes increase. Is that right?
That's right. Right. In particular, for instance, the group earning between 100,000 and 200,000, most of those taxpayers would see a tax increase over the course of the next decade as a result of this bill. That's according to
how. Please explain how.
The main reason is the corporate tax. While it's being depicted as paid only by the wealthy or shareholders, that neither of those are completely true. First of all, let's just stick to the idea that it's paid by shareholders. The first thing to know about that is not all shareholders are rich. Many of them are retirees earning considerably less than 400,000. So as a result, the Joint Committee finds that even in 2023, very early in the budget window, although in that year they assume that all of the corporate taxes paid by shareholders, they find that even there, in all income groups, all of those deciles, all the way down the scale, there are shareholders that own U.S. equities, and they own them in all sorts of forms. But the fact is they are affected by those corporate taxes through that channel. And the second big channel is through workers' wages. And so that effect takes longer to happen. That happens through reduced productivity as a result of corporate taxes. Reduced productivity means lower wages over time. And so that has an effect of further increasing the tax burden ultimately on those on workers all up and down the income scale.
Thank you.
Senator, thank you very much. By the way, no such thing as a free lunch was actually used by Robert Heinlein in 1966, 9 years before the Milton Friedman thing. But apparently it dates back to Epictetus in the first century. So pretty cool. Anyway, thank you, Senator, very much. Now recognize my friend from Texas, Mr. Arrington, for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, witnesses. And I'm driving through God's country out here in West Texas. And so if I
think he just got muted there, Mr. Congressman Arrington.
Can you hear me now?
You're back.
Okay. Look, this notion of fairness in the tax code is intriguing to me. And I want to direct this to Dr. McBride to make sure that I'm using accurate numbers here. But I think some top 1% of the income earners who earn 20% of the total income in the country, but pay 40% of the taxes, doesn't seem fair to me. I think some top 10% of the income earners pay 75 to 85% of the taxes. I guess my point is the tax code is pretty darn progressive. And in fact, even though the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was disparaged for a giveaway to the rich, we actually have a more progressive tax code post Republican tax cuts. Dr. McBride, could you confirm and shape up some of those numbers and percentages I was throwing out there? Do we have one of the most progressive tax systems in the developed world?
That is correct. That was an assessment by the OECD a few years ago. I have not seen a new assessment as to how the U.S. compares to other countries, but safe to say that the U.S. has not changed the progressivity of its tax code a great deal, even after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That's according to David Splinter at the Joint Committee on Taxation. He found that progressivity did not increase measurably, did not change measurably after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Redistribution, a separate concept, did change. Taxes came down. It was a tax cut. And so redistribution in the tax code came down, but the actual progressivity as it is measured did not change appreciably as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
I don't know, what the definition of fairness in a tax code vis-a-vis the Democrat reconciliation tax and spend bill, but to have 10% of Americans paying 80% of the freight in terms of the cost of our government, that doesn't sound very fair to me, especially if you have 40%, roughly, or over 40%, paying zero taxes. And I think that's bad policy, not just on the inequity of that ratio, but I want every American to have a stake in the future of our country. I want ownership. I think that's healthy. It's good. And I think you can make it so that it's reasonable too, relative to their income. Same thing on the whole corporate tax rate. I don't know what the tax rate, I don't have a magic number. I'm not dogmatic about it. It's not the gospel to me. I'm not theological and religious about this. One place I start is, what's everybody else taxing their job creators and their risk takers and their businesses? Because this is a global economy, and I don't want to hamstring the home team while we're competing in away games for customers and markets around the world. And so that's kind of where I start. So it seemed pretty reasonable to me to go from the highest corporate tax rate in the free world, the developed world, to something more competitive, not the best. So when we did that, we had 4,000 inversions in the United States the decade leading up to the tax cuts. We've had no inversions since then. If you talk to biotech, it's just one sample of the economy. 3 out of 4 biotech companies in acquisitions were being purchased by foreign biotech companies or venture capital companies. And today that trend is completely reversed. So I don't think that's an accident that we're more competitive as a result of reducing the tax burden on our job creators. But here's my question on the corporate tax side, because this is disconcerting to me, but it's also because of the effects, but it's also interesting that we can't all see this the same, because the Tax Policy Center, which is more left-leaning, and the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is supposed to be a neutral arbiter of these things, tax policies, and you all have said that the tax increases on corporations, the vast majority, 70% of that, will be borne on working people with higher prices of goods and services in the form of lower wages and benefits. I mean, every think tank and every expert analyses of the policy, left and right, is saying that same thing. Am I getting that right, Mr. McBride? And I yield back. I probably went over my time. Sorry, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman.
I know you don't have the clock in the car. I understand, Congressman.
That's right. That's essentially right, that the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Treasury Department, all major revenue scoring groups such as ours, the Tax Policy Center, Penn Wharton, they all assume that a significant portion of the corporate tax is borne by workers. And so that explains why the Joint Committee finds that so many households, some tens of millions of households in earning less than 400,000 would be ultimately bear the burden of corporate taxes.
Because we've gone so far over, let me pivot to Ms. Huang for her thoughts on this.
So just a sort of a factual clarification, it is true that all of the major estimators do assume that ultimately some of the corporate tax is borne by non-shareholders, but the mainstream estimates are roughly 20 to 25%, not 75%. And in fact, that's what the JCT estimates. It's also really important to note that the intuition that sits behind the models that assumes that this happens also assumes that the cost of any corporate tax cut is fully paid for, because otherwise any private investment change that you see in those tables would get offset by the public debt going up and interest rates going up, and therefore national saving and investment going down. So one of the things that's really important to know is that those tables don't show the ultimate cost of the corporate tax cuts, even though they assume they'll be paid for. So when you try and figure out whether workers actually do benefit, you really need to factor in who ends up bearing the ultimate cost. And that means taking into account things like in the 2017 tax law, the long run costs of the permanent cuts was offset by tax changes that increased taxes for individuals across the board after the 10-year budget window. And that would have made more workers worse off as opposed to better off, even in those models.
Thank you very much. I wish we could talk about this all afternoon, but many other things going on, including missing our Senate Democrats. So I want to thank each of our witnesses for their expert contributions. I'm always marveled how beautifully trained economists with PhDs can so disagree on exactly the same sets of statistics. But asking the wealthy and big corporations to pay their fair share is an essential part of a broader package to help small business thrive, cut taxes for working parents, and invest in education and healthcare, and policies that support our workforce. So Congress has a real opportunity to level the playing field for American small businesses and workers, while also supporting long-term economic growth and promoting labor force participation. So thank you to each of our panelists for their contributions to this timely and important debate. This once-in-a-generation investment in America's future will create long-term, broadly shared economic growth, rebalancing the scale to build back better. And as we do this important work, we're going to rely on your expertise and good faith. So thank you as well to all my colleagues to being part of this discussion and sharing your wisdom. The record will remain open for 3 business days, and this hearing is now officially adjourned. Thank you all very much.